Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's, which is our second part of the webinar. Before we start with today's session, I just wanted to also welcome you as SAAIR instead of UWC as SAAIR, and just share some insight in terms of our events that are coming up, that you are more than welcome to sign up for any of the events. I'll share this document with you. You can follow us on our social media pages, as well as subscribe to our newsletters as well. And also remember, if you are part of the SAAIR membership and you have something to contribute with regards to the learner analytics or any other topic which touches on the aspects of institutional research, and you want to us to assist with offering a webinar for a 1 hour, please let me know so we can arrange and do the administration for you, so that then we can get the people registered. And as one of the mission for SAAIR is to share and develop capacity development and community of practice, and share information with others so that we build capacity within the space as well. And on that note, I would like to hand over back the hosting to Jaral, and he will introduce himself as he does the presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everybody. Allow me to get my screen sharing going. Okay, there we go. All right, welcome everybody to part 2 of our webinar series about a practical introduction to privacy and security for institutional researchers. And today I'm going to focus on broader digital competence. For those that weren't in the first session, I am Jaral, as Elizabeth mentioned, and I am Stellenbosch University's Deputy Information Officer under the Protection of Personal Information Act and the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Before I started working at the university, I worked for a Big 4 accounting firm in the technology risk advisory line, with a focus on security, privacy, and business resilience. So that's me in a half a minute, and then let's get to it. All right, so last time in the previous webinar, we focused on the value of information. And if you can only remember one thing from last time, I'd like you to remember how I consider the value of information. I view it from a cyber criminal point of view. In short, the more harm I can do with a piece of information, the more valuable that piece of information. And the more easily I can do that harm, the more valuable that piece of information is. All right, so that's just a very brief summary of what we focused on last time. And now we're going to get into today. So, as I said, in this series, we're focusing on some key principles of privacy. And I don't want to talk about it in terms of rattling off the conditions of the Act. I want to do something a bit more practical, and that's the design decision behind this webinar series. And today in particular, we're going to be focusing on digital competence with a specific focus on safety and security. And then I'm going to invite everybody to try and figure out what you don't know. And then we're going to wrap that all up with a Q&A session about how this links to privacy. And once again, thanks to UWC for sponsoring the series. All right, and just to set the tone for today, everybody, there's no shame in only learning about something at whatever age you are today. And I've copied a webcomic XKCD which explains it quite nicely. is that we don't try and make fun of people for admitting they don't know things, because for each thing everyone knows by a certain age, in the US, according to the author's maths, there are 10,000 people hearing about it for the first time. All right, and so today, because we're going to look at what you don't know, you might uncover that some of the things you didn't know might have you feeling, embracing, let's call it, negative feelings. So those with your imposter syndromes and your Dunning-Kruger, you might, I don't want you to go down that spiral. I want you to view things as, wow, there's so much more to learn. There's a great opportunity to pick up something new, develop some new skills, and that's the approach we want for today. There are going to be some things that might be a little scary, but as long as we remember this tone that we're trying to set for today, we'll be all right. And with that said, let's look at competence and what does the law say. First, I'm going to present Hanlon's razor, which is never attribute to malice, that which is adequately explained by stupidity, followed by Gray's law. Any sufficiently advanced incompetence is indistinguishable from malice. Now we have a good example of that in the poppy space within South Africa. Recently, the information regulator fined the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development 5 million rand, not because they were hit by a ransomware attack. If you remember a while back, the Master's Office and the courts were heavily impacted by a DOJ ransomware attack that inhibited the functioning and the operations of our courts. And part of what allowed the ransomware attack to succeed was that DOJ did not, if I remember correctly, maintain their security software licenses. So those licenses lapsed, and the protections they offered lapsed with them as well. After the ransomware incident, the regulator went in and delivered an instruction to the Department of Justice that they were to make sure that they reinstated their security software, they reinstated their licenses. And the regulator gave them a month to respond. And in that month, the DOJ did not respond. And that is why the regulator fined them. And two things we can learn from this. The one is that the regulator is not going to fine an organization straight away. That fine only comes in when you have failed to engage with the regulator competently and from a point of improvement and doing better. Secondly, we're faced with an interesting question now when we consider the DOJ. Were they incompetent? That's very worrying. If they didn't know how or didn't know that they should, that's worrying. But perhaps were they malicious? That is equally as worrying. So now our legislation is built on taking reasonable measures to protect personal information. All right. And so if you suffer a breach from a sophisticated attacker that had infinite time, and really it was something new, it was something novel, the regulator isn't going to hit you that hard. But if you either through negligence, or you make a bad decision from a malicious point because you perhaps valuing finance a bit more than the security of the personal information of others, then you're going to get fined. To bring the example home a bit more closely, imagine or think about a potential partner you have, or a colleague, or a child that just does a certain chore very slowly and very poorly and so badly that eventually you just do it yourself, right? That weaponized incompetence. All right, so that's what we're gonna try and tackle today. We're gonna try and address some potential competence gaps, and hopefully keep everybody out of the malicious side of things. So let's move on. So what does PAPIA say about training? So the regulator has released a guidance note which says that information officers must ensure that internal awareness sessions are conducted regarding PAPIA, regulations under the Act, codes of conduct, etc. And it is recommended that information officers and deputy information officers, such as I, receive appropriate training and keep abreast of the latest developments. But then the regulator also says that they are not empowered to provide any training. So we're, from a South African context, we're left with this requirement, but not a clear way of how to address that requirement. So I've looked a bit more broadly to see what's been done elsewhere. So I'm going to share some international expectations. So for me, my equivalents in Singapore are expected to display competence in the 9 competence areas on your screen now. And just perhaps in the chat, or if you want to give us a reaction, of those online today, are there any on this list of 9 that you don't recognize? Just pop them in the chat quickly for us. So the Singapore model is based on competence for 3 roles within their organizations under their privacy legislation. They position an executive level, an individual who is responsible or ultimately accountable for data protection. Then they will have a data protection officer. That's my equivalent. And in large enough organizations, they will also have a group data protection officer. And not all 3 of those roles need to be as competent as one another. There's some room for flexibility. Essentially, the executive would need to know how to apply the subject matter or the principles from the various areas, and they need to uphold those principles. The data protection officer is somebody who would be in position to assess and analyze the application of those principles. And then the more senior, so the group level or the very senior data protection officer, that is someone who would be designing the principles that underpin the activities of the executive and the data protection officer. So I see in the chat, we've got a few responses. So cyber and data breach incident management. Oh, one very interesting thing, I should have started with that. Our legislation specifically calls it personal information. And with zero irony, they refer to data subjects as the individuals to whom that personal information relates. So even in our legislation, it uses information and data as synonyms, essentially. Globally, when talking about privacy, you'll often hear data protection being used. So today, when I mention information and data, I am using them in that interchangeable South African sense of the word, unless it is explicitly required in context that I say one or the other. So if I reference the General Data Protection Regulation of Europe, then I will say data specifically. But otherwise, I might end up mixing my use of information and data as we talk today. All right, so now we've got cyber and data breach incident management. So that is the practice of essentially being prepared to respond to a breach. It's for the pessimists among us. It's not about if a breach would happen, it is about when a breach would happen. And most breach handling methodologies follow a few set phases. The first one is you have a planning and preparation phase. That is when you identify who you would call at 2 a.m. if something went wrong. You would develop the set of tools that would help that person respond quickly to an incident. For example, you say, all right, we need to wake Jarrell up at 2 a.m. if the university suffers an incident. We also need to make sure that he'll be able to respond at 2 a.m. So what tools should we need to provide, etc. We might look at what sort of training we need to provide. And then we'd look a bit more broadly. We can think about, all right, we might need to send out emergency communications given the incident. So maybe we can generate a few pre-existing messages that we can customize in an emergency rather than having to try and draft something from scratch in an emergency. So that's normally phase one of the breach management process. And then if one happens, well, then you have a step where it's about detecting and understanding and analyzing the breach. Then there's a step in containing the breach. And then once it's contained, there is a step towards recovering back to business as usual. And then there's normally a long tail after that involving lessons learned and feeding it back into phase one again, in that preparation phase. It's quite a lot goes into it. And one of the ways to test this without really putting your organization at risk is to run simulations, practice breaches, etc. And that's part of what my job entails. It entails organizing breach simulations where we get people from around the university. We split them into two teams. One team is the attacking team, and they help develop the scenario for the breach. And then we test the other half on what they would do in such a case. So there's quite a lot in cyber and data and breach incident management, and that's only one of the 9. And I see design thinking was highlighted. So design thinking or design science, that is, those are, let's call them researchers and professionals that don't aim to develop something for the lay person. They're designing something for other professionals. And it's normally they're facing a unique problem, and in developing the solution to that problem, they develop some potentially new practices or knowledge that may be worth sharing with other professionals. And so in the context of Singapore, that is about building those processes, that way of thinking, that way of sharing within the organization. It's a way of tackling problems and identifying problems. All right, business risk management. Oof, that's super broad. So the business risk management, let's think about something what's a good risk. An administrative fine from the regulator could be considered a risk, right? And so in business risk management, we'll be looking at, all right, what is the potential impact of such a risk event should it materialize? And we say, oh, the regulator can issue a fine of up to 10 million rand. Okay. And we need to decide for ourselves, is that material? Is 10 million rand really going to hurt us? Or, can we take it? Can we take the knock? And so you build a view of what is the actual impact of that incident. And then you look at, okay, what's the likelihood of that incident happening? It's like, how good are our controls that are already in place to prevent a potential breach or infraction under POPIA? Are we sure that our antivirus licenses are up to date and paid for, and we've patched to the latest level, etc.? Are we sure about that? And from that, you get a view of, okay, what's the likelihood of a breach? And then from that, you can start making decisions on how much you want to invest in mitigating the risk or preventing it. Or you can make a decision, you know what, we can simply accept the risk, or we can try and insure against the risk, or a combination of those. So a lot of different practices going, yeah. For the three that raised the points in the chat, just send a thumbs up that we've covered it. But in short, this is what is expected of me. It's not necessarily expected of all of you, but certainly if you, based on where you work and your role, some of this might be important. The real big thing I want to get into, though, is what you should know. So I'll give just another 15 seconds to see if anybody else has a question about this. All right, let's go. All right, here we go. Now we're going to start looking at what you should know. Europe, the EU, has a rather ambitious plan in place where they're looking to reach a minimum of 80% of Europe's population having some basic digital skills. And to help achieve that, Europe has, or the EU has developed a competence framework for citizens. But first, what is competence? So from South Africa, SAAIR, a position applied competence as the ability to put into practice in the relevant context the learning outcomes required in the process of obtaining a qualification, part qualification. And from there, learning means the acquisition of knowledge, understanding, value, skills, competence, and or experience. And then outcomes means the contextually demonstrated end product specific to learning processes. So in short, applied competence then is putting knowledge and skill into practice guided by specific values. And we see that echoed internationally as well. So from Europe, competence is a combination of knowledge, so what you know, the facts, figures, ideas, theories, and the skills, that's your ability to carry out a certain process, and your attitudes, describing the disposition and mindset to act or react to ideas, persons, or situations. And you'll see that our South African definition aligns very nicely with the EU definition. And very specifically, digital competence involves the confident, critical, and responsible use of and engagement with digital technologies for learning, work, and general participation in society. And I've bolded a few phrases there. The digital competence framework for Europe, or the EU, is based on 5 competence areas. And those are information and data literacy, communication and collaboration, digital content creation, and importantly, that includes your programming, safety, and problem solving. Excuse me. Right, so that is what Europe positions as digital competence. And knowledge and skills, for me, that is one thing that we can teach or train quite easily. We can put up an awareness poster. We can have a session like this. We can teach somebody how a password functions, how password attacks work. If you remember from last time, we discussed credential stuffing, for example. And I'm hoping that once you knew how that attack worked, and after we did our little hack yourself, that you had a think, you now had the knowledge to rethink how you manage passwords. But whether you put that knowledge into play is a question of attitude. So what I've done, we can have a little audience poll now. And Elizabeth, I think if you could help me run the polls while I prattle on, I'd appreciate it. On screen, I'm going to display two attitudes from the safety competence of digital competence overall. And for each attitude that we display, there's going to be a poll. I'm going to ask you to vote yes or no for if you always display the value or attitude discussed. Right, so that's always. First one, I value tools designed to protect search privacy and other rights of users, such as DuckDuckGo. How many of you can just put in the chat, know about DuckDuckGo? Might be easier to ask how many don't know about DuckDuckGo. Oh, here we've got a yes, great. There we go, fantastic. We know some people got some no's and don't knows. It's strange how when you're talking about running an internet search, we use Google as a verb, but Google isn't the only option about it. Yes, I didn't mention it last time. That's correct in the chat. Right. And then before we open the poll, Elizabeth, I'm going to show the second one for this one. There we go. I am vigilant not to leave computers or mobile devices unattended in public places. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Stellenbosch University campus, but we are an open campus and there's a lot of bleed between the town and the university itself. There are lots of coffee shops around. And one thing that I see often in those coffee shops are unattended laptops, unattended mobile devices, someone just standing up to go order another drink, maybe go to the bathroom, and they happily leave their unlocked laptop on the table. We see this in our university libraries. How many of us have been asked, oh, could you just look after my laptop while I run to the bathroom quickly? All right, looking at the poll. Most of you do value tools designed to protect search privacy and other rights of users. So we're all comfortable spinning up our VPNs and our Tor browsers. And most of you say you are vigilant not to leave computers or mobile devices unattended in public places. Does that apply to our open offices? Does that apply to our printers? Do we have a centralized printer that just has piles of documents in the out tray? Thank you. We've got a pretty good view. 60% are aware of privacy tools, and 90% are vigilant not to leave computers and mobile devices unattended in public places. Oh, I wish that was the case for our student body. Okay. I'll end this poll and we'll go to the next. right? Oh, we've got something in the chat. So, Bonza, digital competency strategies generally lack critical component, which is beliefs and attitudes. Yep, highly digital competent people may still underperform due to their beliefs. May you comment on your experience, observations on this, if any. There is a meme, I should have actually copied it for these slides, which discusses the difference between a tech enthusiast and a tech expert. And the enthusiast would wire up their home with the latest voice activated technologies, for example. They'll have a smart fridge, etc. That's the enthusiast. The expert only has one inkjet printer or dot matrix printer from the 90s, and they keep a loaded gun nearby in case the printer makes a funny noise. So that is a meme that maybe if I run such a presentation again, I'll bring that in here. But yes, there are many instances of somebody who's otherwise very knowledgeable and very skilled, simply they're bordering that line of malice. If you remember Hanlon's razor and Gray's law from the start, when we have somebody who has the knowledge and skills and then actively chooses to go against best practice, then it's difficult to say they're not being malicious. That is why I started at that position. It's you're either, if you make a bad decision, that bad decision is either because you didn't know better or because you actively decided to go that route. All right, so let me go to the next slide quickly. All right, I'll put them. Okay. Number 3, we consider self-protective behaviors, such as not using open Wi-Fi networks to make financial transactions. Oof, I'm at the airport, I'm about to catch a flight, but I need to pay something, so I'll just quickly hop onto the airport Wi-Fi or the coffee shop Wi-Fi. Attitude 4. Right. I never fall for phishing. I always carefully consider the possible outcome before clicking a link. Does Starbucks card? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But sometimes there are emergencies. So for that one, I don't always practice that myself, because sometimes there is, as I mentioned, if I need to be called at 2 a.m., I can also be called when I am on leave. And I have to make a decision. Oh, the only way I can either not connect, or I need to connect on a untrusted, or through an untrusted vehicle. And that's where I need to make a decision, right? I need to think about what else can be done. Is there somebody else in the team that who's not on leave and could be contacted to start things off while I get to a better position to connect, right? That one is actually really a tough one, because sometimes you are in that position and you have to make that decision. Of course, there are tools that can help you secure your connection if you have to go through such a vehicle. And the next one, carefully consider the possible outcome before clicking on links. Elizabeth, if we can pop the poll up again for this one. All right, let's see. About 80% consider self-protective behaviors. Oh, and nobody falls for phishing. That's fantastic. 100%. So they always carefully consider possible outcomes. Now, here's one. What about QR codes? QR codes. How do you know a QR code is safe? Never use them. That's a great way to protect yourself from malicious QR codes. How do you know that it's safe to use a particular QR code? There are some browsers like DuckDuckGo that have protections built in if you use them to access a QR code. So your choice of tool that you use to scan a QR code can help protect you, right? But I'm one of those old people. I dislike going to a restaurant and then they don't hand me a physical menu. I get given a QR code to go find the menu online. Oof, that is not the dining experience I am looking for. There we go. Here's the restaurant comment there. Right. So those of you who are used to using, for example, SnapScan, right, scanning those QR codes. Yeah. You got to think of QR codes. Right. So we got to think of QR codes as another vehicle. It's a link. And if we're going to be using them, how do we know that they're safe? And then again, for example, what if we are running an awareness campaign on campus about privacy, and then we put QR codes on our posters rather than a plain text link? We might be confusing our own messaging, etc. Yeah. But enough about QR codes. Right, so 81% said self-protective behaviors, Wi-Fi, and a dip. When I mentioned QR codes, there was a slight dip in never click on or always consider the possible outcomes before clicking a link. Okay. Let's go to the next one. I always focus on physical and mental well-being and avoid the negative impacts of digital media. One thing I find very interesting about the European model is there's also a focus on health as part of safety, your own physical and mental health as well. And one of the expected attitudes is that you are aware of the potential negative impacts of doom scrolling on your phone. And number 6, I am careful about keeping one's own and other personal information private. How many of you have children? And then happily post pictures of them on WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups. How many of you wish happy birthday publicly to colleagues? I want you to cast your minds back a few years. Remember, we used to have when you forgot a password back in the day, there wasn't a handy reset mechanism. Instead, you had a bunch of questions that you could pick when setting up the password that if you ever forgot your password, you would be challenged with these questions. And then if you answered them correctly, you would be able to change your password or access your password. Who remembers that? right? The answers to those questions are often buried in things like birth dates. I'm even paranoid enough that on my phone, I don't save my mother's phone number under mom, because I'm worried that if somebody got hold of my phone, they would also get that relationship information and may be able to exploit it. That's maybe me being a bit paranoid, but I go that far. Right. Yes, we got one. It doesn't even show family photos on WhatsApp. Here's a tough one. Here's a really tough one. Say you're a parent and you've got a child, and your parent, so the grandparent in this case, is the one taking photos and share of your child and sharing it on Facebook. Anyone had that awkward conversation? Oh, here we go. Let's look at the chat quickly. PeopleSoft still uses that security mechanism. Really interesting. I haven't used PeopleSoft in a long while, so that's interesting. Yes, requesting that family don't share photos or information. I've got one colleague, her son's photo was scraped and then used in advertising and marketing. And it took a lot of effort to get those adverts taken down. And after that, she no longer shares his photos in easily accessible, through easily accessible vehicles. Ooh, now we're getting into photos. Thought you had to have a disclaimer sign to use photos. Ooh. So photos, there's a lot to be said about it. So when I'm faced with a question about photos, I start off by asking, what is the expected, or what is the expectation to privacy in that context of the photo? And if I think about it's a sports match and there's a photo taken of the stadium and the people in the audience there, your expectation to privacy is quite low in that context. That's taking that photo is probably okay. But if you're doing a specific portrait shot of an individual, that expectation to privacy is probably a lot higher. So I always start there. And then after that, there is another series of questions that you can be asking yourself, such as, what is the intended use of the photo? Right? Is it something I'm hoping to sell? You need to ask yourself those questions. And then if you look at the other principles of POPIA, such as the involving the subject of the photo in the use, in the decisions around the use of that photo, that's important. And how you do that, that's going to vary. So perhaps you need a model release form based on the current context. But for me, as long as we ask those two questions first, that normally leads into the other actions we need to take around a photo. In my experience, most of our universities, the corporate communications or equivalents, those functions, they generally have a good view and understanding of this. Right. So if you do have those questions, normally your internal marketing team can help you. If not them, then probably your legal advisors. But I normally start with those two questions, and then we go from there. There we go. Talk to publicists first. We also see, this question also pops up about photos and conferences, for example. Not everybody wants a photo taken of them while they're at the lunch table with the spoon halfway to their mouth. All right. So what I've been seeing over the last, let's say, 5 years or so is, of course, based on the nature of the conference, is different approaches. So many are using a photo area or a photo booth. And that's the only place where photos happen. But you can have props, etc., the best background, best scenery, and so on. So I've seen that put into practice. I've seen some more extreme options where when you signed up, you could choose the color of your lanyard, and that was an indication whether you'd be comfortable for a photo or not. There's a, I don't want to make this a session about photos, so I'll pause there for now. Okay, but let's look at what else is in the chat. An idea to open an email account for kids to save things for them. I've seen mention of this practice quite often. For example, emailing your child on their birthday, for example, even when they're just 1, for them to read when they're 18. That, I think, could be pretty cool. And remember, last time, an important lesson about Papier that I tried to get across was not about what it is we're doing. That's not the most important. It's about how we're doing it. So the idea of having an email account for your kids, one, you preserve the username, which, and so they don't need to have a string of digits after it. That's a benefit too. Okay. But it's more about how. How are you sure that that is secured? So for example, let's say you're using Gmail, okay, and you've linked it to your own Gmail account so that if anything happens in that child account, you get an alert. If you put those measures in place, then it's a good idea, and you're doing it with a good how as well. Okay, so let's look at our results. Ooh. Just under half of you might be overusing your technology, gaming till 3 a.m. And an even split between keeping one's own and others' personal information private. Even split. All right, to summarize, what I'll try to get across with those attitudes is, from a privacy perspective, we have responsibilities. And for me, the first responsibility is always to protect your own personal information, because in doing so, you take steps to protect the personal information of others. Now, let's think about those 6 attitudes we went through. Okay, most of you said, always vigilant. Do not leave your devices unattended in public spaces. Great. But now imagine that you were not that vigilant person. Think about the information held on your devices. If you left your laptop unlocked on a coffee shop table while you went to the bathroom, what sort of information could be pulled from there about others? Students, for example, colleagues, family. See, by looking after our own stuff, our own laptop, we are protecting the privacy and the personal information of others too. So that's the big message I wanted to get across today. But what about what you don't know? So the EU has made a self-assessment tool where right now you can self-assess your digital competence against their framework. They say it takes about 25 minutes, but you can do it in the 9 or so minutes we have left now. That's it for our formal presentation. Floor is open for extra questions. Just to summarize, what I wanted to get across is that competence is not just about what you know and what you can do. It is also about your attitude. And your attitude is the big difference between negligence and malice. All right. So that is the big decider for us. It's our attitude. Right? And with that in mind, our key responsibility from a privacy perspective is to protect ourselves first. I think I mentioned it last time as well. The analogy is the oxygen masks in an airplane, they deploy. We're always told, put your own mask on first before helping others, right? Because if you're able to breathe normally, you're more able to help somebody else. Right? So that is the big lesson I want us to walk away from. And then this link on the last slide, this is a tool that you can use to assess what you don't know. The way the tool outputs the report at the end, it is by the 5 competences I mentioned, and it'll give you a rating between 1 and 8. 1 is foundation, so nursery school. There in Europe, they have digital competence for nursery school. 6, level 6, that is for a high school leaver, and level 8 is for experts. So for each of the competences, they all say, all right, you're a level 3, yeah, you're a level 6, yeah, etc. And you use that as a way to think about, okay, is this okay for me to be a 3 on content creation when my job is a programmer? Maybe I should get that a bit higher. And this tool can help guide you to other resources for self-improvement. So that's it. And remember the XKCD comic I put up at the start? All right. It's nothing to feel bad about if you didn't know something. It's more of it's a great opportunity to learn something new. And that's what I'd like to encourage. So we have just we've got about 6 minutes left of our formal time. So those of you who are really fast, if you managed to get through the self-assessment already, and you want to share some of your experiences, please do. Otherwise, next time we chat, I'd like to hear about what you thought about it. The way this self-assessment works, it asks a few questions about your confidence, and then from there it forks the questions. And so somebody who says they're very confident, or they're going to get the hard questions. So treat it as a fun tool. I saw a comment about sharing with family, etc., and children. Yes, ask them to do this as well. I think this is a great tool, but do note it is imperfect. The tool is timed. It doesn't test your ability to go find out, which is another competence. So if you had half an hour to answer each question, could you still do it? Right. So the tool is imperfect, but it's a great starting point. Right, Elizabeth, I'll keep quiet for now if you have anything else to add.
I actually don't even have anything to add to the conversation that we just had now. And I think it was very valuable, and linking it to what we went through the last month to now looking at digital competency. I think now everybody is now fully aware of what is expected of us in terms of the work that we do, because we work in institutions, we deal with personal information, and we need to know and do better in protecting our own information and also protecting others while doing it. And I think this was a very valuable session for us, and it will stay with us for a very long time. Thank you again, Gerald, for
my pleasure, Elizabeth.
Yeah, for always raising your hand to always upskilling us. I'm going to open it for others to give input, questions, comments. Gerald is here. This is our last day. We have 4 minutes. Anyone? Are there any aha moments? Anything you want to say it out loud? You can unmute.
Hi, it's Bonza here.
Yes, go ahead, Bonza.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. This was very helpful. I just wanted to ask if there's any national tool for a context like this that has been developed yet, or are there any sort of plans to actually create something for that for the South African or the African context? That's sort of aligned to where we are in terms of development and where we're going.
So for a national tool, I haven't found one. I've looked and haven't. My own personal studies, though, I am looking at the CAPS curriculum and how that maps or doesn't map to the European expectations. So that is my own research. I realize maybe I should have submitted it for the conference as a paper, but that's what next year's for, right? But no, there is no tool that I am aware of right now. We might see a bit of this in the Academy of Science Code of Conduct for PAPIR. The draft that went out for public commentary, I think it was in May, explicitly broke down how a researcher should do a personal information impact assessment as part of their research data management planning. So that is as close to a tool that we've got at a national level that I've discovered. There might be something in the works though. For example, I know the Department of Basic Education is piloting a curriculum on robotics and coding, I think from grade R to grade 8, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not like things are not happening. We don't have a tool like the European one yet.
There more comments, questions? Feel free. Okay. Gerald, it seems like they're opting to send you some acknowledgement in their chat, so you can read instead of them talking.
I see them. Thank you, everyone.
And it's all positive. And thank you very much for the session. Any final word before we close off?
For me, just have fun with the assessment. Remember, it's not supposed to be there to make you feel bad or scare you. It should be exciting, something new. They've got a whole section on AI. I know you all have generative AI questions too, but that's for another time. But have fun with the tool. I hope you learn a lot from it.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who was part of today's session and engagement. Enjoy the rest of your day. Till next time. Bye.
Bye.
And thank you, Gerald.